So adverse childhood experiences, that's what the acronym stands for, include a number of different experiences, and the core research focuses on 10 particular adverse childhood experiences, and I'm not going to list all of those, but it's things like child abuse or neglect, witnessing domestic violence in the household, particularly violence against a female parent figure. It's suffering sexual abuse oneself. So any time that a child has experienced these things under the age of 18, it affects formative development. And what the research has found is that the more different types of adverse childhood experience that a person has in those first 18 years, the more likely they are to have long-term negative impacts from that experience. So in a community like Jefferson County, if we think about these adverse experiences as individualized experiences, we miss the community level impacts. So I like to think about this work as really the work of building human potential. And when we as a community don't embrace our role in preventing and mitigating the impacts of adverse childhood experiences, we reduce the development of human potential in our communities. And when we do that, it affects all of us. It affects our economy, it affects our quality of life and our quality of place. So I think it's important that we all recognize what's going on and take responsibility for contributing to the solutions. So it's interesting, the original ACEs research came out in 1998. And so, it's 25 years later, we're starting to really see it come to full fruition in communities, people embracing the notion of needing to be, for example, trauma-informed. And so other communities that I've worked with and that I've read about, really shifting to trauma-informed models. And what that means, for the most part, is really shifting from when we see, for example, a behavior that may seem off at school. Instead of saying, what's wrong with you to that child, saying, what happened to you? Or even to that adult. So I volunteer at a homeless shelter, for example. And most of the people who experience being unhoused are also people who suffered adverse childhood experiences. And sometimes you see an odd behavior, somebody's having a rough day, and maybe they're starting to act out or struggle in a situation that doesn't seem to warrant that. Instead of thinking, what's wrong with this person? Shifting that frame to what happened to you allows us to be compassionate and responsive. So trauma-informed communities are now emerging, where they're trying to help lots of different actors in the community understand what trauma is and how it affects people. And they want everybody from the school bus driver and the teachers to the hairdressers to be recognizing when people seem to be in struggle and finding ways to reach out and support those folks. I would say it means recognizing that what you may be observing or experiencing in a given moment may be about the baggage somebody's bringing with them. So, for example, if somebody's having an outburst or responding negatively to something that doesn't seem to warrant that level of response, it seems out of proportion to what's happening, recognizing that person is having an experience that is not just about what's happening in that moment. And then being compassionate and kind about that and giving them the space to be having the experience they may be having. I think it's important for people to understand that the reason that ACEs impact child development is that it's physiological. We're not talking about pure, emotional or psychological, if you will, but rather the physiology of emotions and experiences. So what happens in the body is actually that, we all have that fight or flight reflex, and that reflex saves us. It's very helpful to us. It gets us out of danger, right? It alerts us when we need to be on higher alert. When that goes on too long or too consistently is activated, that releases cortisol in the body. And that's a stress hormone. And those stress hormones can cause damage to the body. And anybody who's an adult who is, worried about heart disease, for example, knows this, right? The reason we're supposed to be mindful and, do our yoga is to try to lower that cortisol. Well, in young children, that actually affects the wiring of the brain. When the brain is developing and you have toxic stress like that, it actually can permanently affect the wiring in the brain in ways that affect, for example, the pleasure center of the brain. So somebody who grows up with a lot of trauma, the pleasure center of their brain has been changed in ways that mean it may take more of something to satisfy them. So for example, the original research on ACEs was done on people who suffer obesity. That's partly because this rewiring means it takes more for those folks to feel sated, to feel full when they eat. And so actually adverse childhood experiences cause, for many people, overeating. It's also why it causes substance use disorder, right? Somebody whose brain has been rewired in this way will require more alcohol or more of a certain drug to feel the same effect as somebody who did not experience that trauma. So it actually changes how the brain works.
So how do ACEs impact a child's development? I'm going to say that ACEs, those things that we experience in our home, those challenges, the dysfunction that we experience in our home, can impact the way that a brain develops, and can kind of get us stuck in a stage of brain development that doesn't allow us to move past that. We do all of our thinking out of our prefrontal cortex. That's where we feel safety, that's where we feel joy, that's where we feel curiosity and connection. And if we've experienced substantial ACEs in our life, we may have not gotten to be able to access that part. So we can be working out of our brainstem, out of our amygdala, which doesn't think, has no capacity to think, and so we just react. And so that's where we see some of those impulsive behaviors in school. It can also affect their cognitive ability to learn and process information. It can look like gaps in their education. There might be a time in life where a person is experiencing tremendous dysfunction in their home, and they're coming to school and they're checked out. They're not hearing, they're not remembering what we're saying. They're not remembering their multiplication facts, how to spell words, how to write a paragraph. And that's what we want them to be able to do, but they're in a different state of their brain. And so it could impact all of that. The other way ACEs can impact a child's development is sort of in a positive way. It's not positive that these dysfunctions are happening, obviously, but with resilience and a protective factor, somebody in their life that's their champion, their cheerleader, and learning about your own brain, right? People can learn how to regulate themselves, soothe their survival brain to be able to access that prefrontal cortex, to prime that brain for learning. So when we first started talking about this was a question that really struck with me, and I wanted to make sure that I spent some time thinking about my work in this community over 21 years as a counselor in this district with K-12 experience. So, I started off in an elementary school, go Rikers Ridge, and then I moved to the high school, then I moved to the junior high, and now I'm back at the high school. So for me, as I was thinking about it, I'm working with 4 generations of families. I have students that I'm working with now who I worked with their parents. They were being raised by a grandparent because their parent had significant trauma, significant challenges in life. And now I'm working with the student again. So I see it over time, and I see the successes, right? I see those protective factors that we talked about a minute ago. That grandparent, that great-grandparent. I can't tell you how many students I work with who are being raised by a grandparent or a great-grandparent. I see that grandparent as a protective factor and somebody that is a consistent person in their life, like the bumper on their car. So when all those things are happening to them, they're there to cushion that blow and help with success. So how have I experienced the impact of ACEs in students at school? Some of the main stuff is, all those behaviors that you see, those acting out behaviors, impulsivity, lethargy, apathy, outbursts, just struggles, are all things that we notice in the school. And when I think about those behaviors, what that's showing to me as a counselor who knows about ACEs and the impact of ACEs is that they're showing me pain. Right? All those behaviors are really just them, something's going on in here, something's going on in here. It's automatically happening to me, right? Because when you're talking about ACEs, it impacts your autonomic nervous system, right? This is all a nervous system response to what's happened to us in life. And so then that's my role to try to say, hey, instead of this kid just acting out because they're a jerk, right? I'm looking at it beyond that. You're showing me your pain. You trust me enough to show me your pain. And so I'm going to hold that special, and I'm going to respond to you in that way. So we have to remember ACEs are those things that you experience in your home. Social media for young people, most of the harm that they're experiencing is from outside their home on social media. It's increased people's ability to hurt each other in a second. There's things out there in technology that, video games, just violence, glorifying violence, perpetuating violence, enforcing violence. Social media has, I think, gotten humans thinking, am I good enough? Am I living up to their expectation? Am I meeting their expectations? So those are kind of the negative things, right? Those are the things that we all know about. You can hurt each other a lot easier. However, help can be at your fingertips. You can YouTube anything you want and find breathing exercises, which help settle the amygdala. You can find self-help videos. You can learn about ACEs at the drop of a hat. So technology makes the world smaller, in that we can tap into those resources a little bit easier. But at the same time, we have to learn how to balance that, just like we have to learn to balance everything in life, because technology can give us that real ability to hurt, and with anonymity too, right? When we're hurting somebody online, we don't see their face, we don't read their nonverbals, their facial expressions, and know that, oh my gosh, I just hurt that human. It's going to tap into my empathy, right? And I might change my behavior. So I was a counselor in this district before we even talked about ACEs, right? And so I saw all those behaviors. And then when I learned about ACEs and learned about neuroscience and the brain and the power of the brain, it kind of tied all those things together, things that I've been seeing in students, just that look in their eyes when, they're not thinking. Kids would say, I'm blacking out, I get so angry, I black out. Well, I never really understood that until I learned about it. So what I've noticed over time is, educators are becoming more aware of ACEs, and so we're changing ourselves, right? The impact of knowledge of ACEs has given educators and helpers, not just educators, right? Anyone who is a helper in our community, the knowledge that it starts with us first. We have to be regulated. It takes a regulated brain to co-regulate with somebody else, right? And until I'm aware of physiologically where I feel stress in my body, and when I'm stressed out, I'm not going to be my best for that student. I need to take time for myself. That's been really important in understanding and changing things over time. For students, the behaviors that I knew were from home or something that they were experiencing, it makes much more sense to me now, and I know how it's impacting their brain. So we're able then to create touch points, like these little micro points, moments with them, everything from a smile to just noticing you got a new haircut or it's your birthday and saying happy birthday, and just being really intentional about how we're treating students. It's also allowed us to do what we call kind of discipline on the front end, right? Create this environment where students feel safe and connected to the learning, and it helps them tap in. Now, there's a lot of students who you see that fight, flight, or freeze right in the classroom. They don't know an answer. They just got a text on social media that's upsetting them. Something happened at night. They didn't have enough to eat, right? You can see that. It might come across as another behavior. You're lazy, you're apathetic, you don't care, right? But there's something behind that. And so it's allowed us to teach students so that they can say, hey, this is what's happened, but I can move beyond that.
In my efforts to understand ACEs more in the education that I've received and the literature that I've read, I've learned that it's best to ask the question, what happened to you and avoid the question, what's wrong with you? And the more our community can learn to look at our family members, our friends, people we know who are suffering from addiction or suffering from mental health concerns and challenges, or just overall challenges in life, the better we can appreciate ACEs and understand that, you know, that might be playing a role here. Maybe that's what's going on. And the more we learn not to say, what's wrong with you, but what happened to you, it just, to me, would make a significant impact. It'd help people understand more. And, you know, knowledge is power, and understanding is empowering. When you talk about people in our community who are struggling with addiction, or are struggling with mental health issues, or are struggling with those day-to-day challenges that they're having trouble overcoming, giving them that understanding that something else is going on here. It's not something's wrong with me, it's something happened to me. And I think giving them the ability to appreciate and understand that will give them perhaps the strength to make different decisions in their lives and in the lives of their children.
So whether it's the incarceration of a caregiver, or the loss of a family member, or abuse and neglect, emotional trauma, experiencing community violence, or microaggressions, or racism, or even just some things like chronic poverty. Those things are all encompassing for the child. But there's also these aspects where it's about the perception for the child, right? So although we may not see it as a very large thing in their world, it's the biggest thing that there is. So when we talk about how that can affect them, we know that in general, when we're talking about development and developing brains, we know that that happens mostly in childhood, right? There's some that happens in early adulthood, but mostly in childhood. And when we're expecting these neuronal connections to sort of help them with their reasoning and their interpretations of things and how they learn in their emotional regulation, that is a time when they're having these adverse events and they're really starting to notice that those neuronal connections are being lost. And when we're losing those neuronal connections at a time when we're expecting them to grow, we have an ultimate concern. So now we have children who are having issues with self-regulation, and they're having issues with communication and learning and being able to self-soothe and regulate.